This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, my red light's on, so let's go. Welcome back. Good evening, everyone. I finished on this slide last week, so I'm just picking up from where I left off. I did go through it, but I went through it reasonably quickly, so I think I'll just go again, just for clarity. We were started to talk about the other category of sources of debt for projects, having looked at the two main categories, which is bank lending and bonds. In the other are the categories of the export credit agencies and the multilateral agencies. I spoke about what export credit agencies are, and where we got to is to say, well, there are going to be some circumstances where you can get loan funds from an export credit agency, but it needs to be linked directly to the purchase of equipment for the project in a foreign country, produced or manufactured in the home country. So it's often by the sponsors, but not necessarily. It could be from an unrelated party, but in the home country, for example, Australian companies going out to other countries or US or whatever. So if there is a need to export equipment, the export credit agencies may agree to a loan to fund the purchase of that equipment. Now, I've said here on favourable terms, and we often see the side questions are put in italics. They're the things that you should think about and should be able to answer going forward throughout the semester. Why is it on favourable terms? Just to get you thinking again, the export credit agencies are there to assist with export. So their mandate is not to make profit on lending like bank lenders, but rather to provide loans to assist with the export process. So when they do provide loans, they won't charge a full market rate on the loans. So it's a good outcome. The word alternatively, and I even said last week, it's not alternatively, accordingly. It can be used to replace a shortfall of bank lending, because when you think about it, if you can carve away some of the expenditure to specific equipment, if the lenders won't give you the full $800 million, something less, they say we'll give you 700, and you have to look around for other funds, well, this is a viable alternative. Now, the numbers don't always line up exactly, but it makes it much easier to fill any shortfall. And it's a practical issue for those sort of projects where, I've said where country risk is high, but it's not only country risk, but it is usually. The reason that lenders don't always want to lend the full amount that's been requested, one of the reasons is because they like the project, they like the cash flows, but they're just a bit worried about the country risk. And that's why they say, look, we do like your oil operations project, but we're not going to lend the whole $800 million that you've asked for. And this could come to make up the shortfall. But it's not the main thing that the ECAs do. I think I finished off by saying last week that I've introduced it at this point on the basis that we're looking at sources of funds for projects. And this is a source of debt funds, but it's not their main thing, with a couple of exceptions. A couple of exceptions, they do spend, a couple of the ECAs do a lot of lending, but most of them do other things. Supporting exports, credit enhancements. So they can give loan guarantees, so they can give a guarantee that the loan will be repaid. And when you think about that, that's a great credit enhancement in terms of giving the lender some comfort. If the lenders say, oh, we're worried about this, an export credit agency says we'll guarantee the SPV's loan repayment, then that's very strong. Or they'll give political risk insurance or credit risk insurance. They're variations on the theme. The risks associated with dealing in other countries. Now, we're going to look at guarantees and and political and credit risk insurance in more detail when we look at risk and mitigation over the next 2 weeks. A major example, or example of one of the main ones, is the US Exim Bank, Export-Import Bank. So it's set up as an export credit agency, but also as a bank. So it's one of the ones that does focus more on lending. So providing direct loans, which I keep calling co-financing because it's never instead of bank lending, it's always alongside bank lending. To finance the purchase of products manufactured in the US that would be used by projects located outside the US. It also gives these other insurances as well. There's a lot of ECAs around the world. So US has another very large one called OPIC. I can't remember what it stands for, but the O is overseas and the IC is investment credit. Australia's equivalent is EFIC. Then you've got large ones in the UK, Canada, Japan, France, Italy, and so on. I've hyperlinked some of them. Again, if you're interested in the area, have a look, but it's not a must, knowing each individual export credit agency. One thing that has arisen, and it's really sort of unrelated to the learning that we're doing, but it has an impact in practice, and that is that in recent years there's been a lot of debate and sort of argument about why are the export credit agencies helping these large-scale projects. Because when you think about it, and when we go through it we'll see more, in most of these projects the sponsors are very large multinationals. We've already seen a couple of examples and we'll continue to see that. So they're large and fairly wealthy companies. And then they're using these resources that weren't traditionally meant to be used to help them. Export credit agencies were meant to help the exporters in their countries that were having problems just not understanding what the overseas markets were and were dealing with the potential credit defaults and that sort of thing. So there's these overseeing bodies that we'll talk about a little more when we get to it later in the semester that say, well, it's not really an appropriate use. And export credit agencies, you shouldn't be helping these large projects. It's not something that you've been set up to do. So a bit of debate. The same with the MLAs, when I get to that as well, for the same reason. So, as I've already said, there's a number of different services, and even though we've introduced it in the context of loans being available to projects, it's not their main service. And you can see from this slide that it's not their main service. It's getting a bit old now, but it's probably representative of how the market is overall. There's only one of the ECAs, the main ones in the world, that is purely a loans ECA, and that's one of the two in Brazil, and the other one in Brazil is purely credit insurance. You'll see that in Japan and China, it's mainly insurance type products, but also mainly insurance type products, credit insurance, also some guarantees. In the US, it's pretty much the same. That there's a bit of lending in there with Exim, but insurance and guarantees. These other ones where it's a solid black colour, it's a mix of services. So that's just to give you an idea. In Australia, you can see Australia is not a very big player in this market. Very small relative to everything else. So the other type of potential lenders in the other category are what I've introduced as the multilateral agencies. And essentially multilateral agencies are, as it says here, aid agencies. They're bodies that have been set up to assist, in most cases, development, so providing development aid or development assistance. And there's national organisations and there's international organisations. So multilateral just means a number of parties. And obviously bilateral is a variation. You might also see the term Development Finance Institutions, DFIs, and these are within the category of multilateral agencies, but they're more focused on finance than some of these. So there's the hyperlink. While I'm waiting for that to happen. The mandates of these ones do vary quite significantly. Some of them focus purely on very poor countries, some focus on essentially helping with policy development more so than economic development and so on. But broadly speaking, they provide support for development programs. And similarly, like the export credit agencies, in recent years, large-scale projects have said, well, what we're doing falls within your mandate. You, multilateral agency, what you're trying to achieve is help development in Central Africa. So we're going to do a project there, you should be able to help us in the project. And it has been happening. Now, did I get that? There. Okay. So you can see that the multilateral agencies are, lots of them are banks, but things like UN. UN's a multilateral agency. The World Bank, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, Colombo Plan, lots of different banks, and a lot of them have development or infrastructure in their names. So these are what I'm talking about when I talk about the multilateral agencies. The ones that are most relevant to project finance are those ones that, as we saw, call themselves banks, and they effectively operate as banks, but again, banks that aren't driven by the profit motive. They're not the ones that maximise their interest rate income relative to the cost of their debt. What they're trying to do is make sure that that's a viable commercial business so it can help with the development, with the main goal. So the multilateral development banks, we saw a handful of them on that slide before. The main one is the World Bank, and the World Bank, you would have heard something about it without thinking too much about it. It is as it sounds, you know, it's a very sort of, it's large international development, you know, it's the banking side of the UN in a sense. Then you've got Asian Development Bank, International Finance Corp, MIGA, and some others as well. So again, these particular ones do operate as banks in the sense that it's a lot of borrowing and lending, but they do provide more broad services than just loans and guarantees. So let's look at a couple of them. IBRD and IDA, or IDA, their role is to promote institutional, legal and regulatory reform. One of them focuses on governments of member companies with per capita income between 1,025 and 6,055. So per capita income is average annual income. So if there's 100 people there, no, let's not even go there. It's, you know what it is. IDA focuses on the ones at the very low end, from they're the ones that have per capita income of less than $1,025. So if you think of that, if that's the average income, and you know that in a lot of these countries there are upper classes that earn a lot of income, it says a lot about how little the masses earn. I mean, $1,000 a year is, you know, what, $3 a week, isn't it? Something like that. 1,025 is about $3 a week. That's hard to live on. So you can see both of them, they provide technical assistance. So they actually go in and they, rather than charging for development programs, they actually give the technical expertise to get it going. Loans here, and these are interest-free loans because they just can't pay interest. Policy advice. These other two focus a little bit more on the development. Well, this is private sector development, so it helps the private companies doing any development projects. So you can see that it gives, maybe even contributes equity where required, or long-term loans, or risk management advisory services. So you can see that project finance falls within this, because there's no sort of limitation on the per capita income within the country that you're operating in. It's just that you're actually doing private sector development. Here, this is more focused on political risk. Okay, so that's just hitting the high spots in terms of the alternative sources of funding for projects. In both cases, it's as I said, it's a little bit of a hot potato on the world stage, a bit of a hot topic, because a lot of the overseeing bodies don't like the ideas that these agencies, multilateral agencies or export credit agencies, are helping very large companies in their projects, when in fact, even though it technically falls in the mandate, it's not what they were set up for. So let's go back to the start of last week and summarise the cost of a project. So we spent a bit of time talking about the cost of a project. And the takeout from that is that you have to be able to just think about, all right, they're spending a lot of money, surely I can understand what the categories are. And once you do that, you also need to understand that, all right, once we've done an estimate, then that's the amount that we have to fund. So it's a group of assets, it's the cash cost of constructing, and it's funded by equity and project debt. Project finance technically refers to the debt, and it's the debt that is borrowed by the SPV, and it's added to the sponsor's equity to fund the full project cost. It's pretty straightforward when you think of it that way, but if you've got a gap in this knowledge, you sort of don't really put it back together when you put it together when you're going forward and thinking about other things. Project debt can comprise short and long-term borrowing. It can be fixed or variable interest rates and negotiated payment terms. And we spoke about the different lenders that can provide these different features. There are many possible lenders to projects, as we saw, but the market is dominated by variable interest rate loans that are medium term at best, provided by bank syndicates. And we spend a bit of time carefully going through what explains that observed phenomenon. Loans from these other agencies might be available if your circumstances fall within their mandates. Okay, so these are the questions out of lecture 2. Let's pick it up here with the next lecture. So today, once I go through the questions, I'll go through the concept of why we do risk analysis, why we do risk assessment and allocations, and then introduce the concept of project risks, specific types of project risks. Identify some of the main costs of a large-scale project. How are they estimated? This is one of those coverage questions. It covers what we did last week. If I was asking it on an exam, I wouldn't say a large-scale project. I'd say a power plant project or a gold mining project or a toll road project or something like that. But I've not done that here, so what are the main costs?
I would lump them in 3 main categories. First would be land and our transport of land, that's construction. Second category would be all the machinery or technology equipment that I would need to make that project run. And a third category would be all those expenses or costs that are related to how do I get there, or how do I put together the project in terms of what lawyers, consulting firms, and the purpose that we have to require.
And that's pretty good because that's quite exhaustive. Probably your categories are a little broad if you're asked to be a bit more specific, but you're right, you have covered what the main areas are. Within the, getting the land and the construction, you might talk a little bit more specifically about the construction, what you're constructing. If it's a mine, of course, you have to talk about the drilling and that sort of thing. With equipment, as you said, you can broadly say that, but you might want to specify the main types of equipment. But generally speaking, you're on the ball, you're on the mark with that answer. How are the costs estimated?
I guess the best thing to do would be a methodology. How the final thing looks like, and then go backwards. In terms of even the tiniest little things, bolts that I would need to make this thing work.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, that you look at the big picture and you then break it down into all of the components. That's right. Even down to the bolts, I suppose. You probably need a lot of bolts in some of these projects. So, essentially paraphrasing what we went through last week, you need to have, you need to identify the main cost because you're identifying the categories. And once you've got the main cost categories, you have to determine the breakdown of costs within those categories. So how do you do it? Well, once you've decided what the categories are, that I need oil platforms and drilling rigs, I need pipelines, I need offshore structures, I need onshore structures, which are the particular the production facilities and the storage facilities and the waste disposal facilities and the export facilities. Once you've got all of those things, you then need to determine all the costings within those categories. So how do you do that, I suppose, is the question. And the answer is you do it the best way you can in terms of the information available. In some cases, you know the exact cost of the equipment because the supplier's already told you what they'll charge you. Things like pipeline, as I said before, there's an established market. So it's really just a calculation. Number of kilometres times diameter of the pipe times material composition. That sort of thing. There are other things that aren't so easy to estimate in terms of the construction costs. Even though you've got a construction contract, you're not going to be able to be 100% sure that the construction materials cost what you're forecasting, especially going out a few years. Manpower, you might struggle a little bit with pricing the manpower. You might, in the initial stages, not have a very good handle on what the engineering design costs are. You've got an idea of how you want it to look, but until you get the designers in, and who have to have some very technical engineering knowledge to make the design workable, you might struggle a little bit to price all of that, or you might not, because you might go to a firm that says, we know how to do this, and this is what we'll charge you. So the answer to that is you need to locate all available information and the best available information. Discuss the different forms of equity capital. That's a boring question, isn't it? The different forms. Cash from the sponsors, IPOs, placements. Identify circumstances when they would be suited. In a sense, that's the more interesting part of the question, but it's also probably a little bit hard to answer. The only pattern we're going to see throughout the whole semester is this concept that I spoke of last week of IPOs. The IPOs typically only seem to be for transport infrastructure, so toll roads or tunnels like the Eurotunnel, railway systems. Otherwise, it's nearly always just cash from equity sponsors. What's a letter of credit facility? Yeah, economically that's what it is, a guarantee of payment, correct. Who gives it? Third party, which is usually a bank, yes. Usually your banker provides it, so it's a guarantee provided by the bank. So why do we need this sort of guarantee in project finance? Yeah, it's to break the stalemate that you're describing. The stalemate as to who blinks first. If neither party blinks first, the transaction doesn't get done. So in project finance, it facilitates specific, usually equipment purchases, cross-border. And that might have come as a surprise to you, that sort of example last week, but it's actually quite common in business that you have to run by, and especially large companies, they've got very strict policies and procedures. And the policies and procedures say don't pay for anything that hasn't been sent. And you work for the Australian branch of a large US multinational, you don't want to break that very strong policy because they're going to sack you if you do. because they said, this is our worldwide policy, it's a very important one. You don't pay until you get delivery. So you can see there's that rigidity on one side of the transaction that's probably replicated on the other side of the transaction with the supplier. So this guarantee is a necessary mechanism. So what are its advantages? The main one is that it gets it done. What's the main disadvantage? Expensive, costly, absolutely. It's free money for the banks in some cases, because they know you're going to pay, as I said before. They've got the money sitting there. They're ready to send it across. They know you're going to pay. It's an easy guarantee to give. Describe the roles of both financial advisors and lead managers. Look, again, this is a coverage question. I don't think I'd ever actually ask it, to tell the truth, because lead managers are the representative of the lenders, and that's the main thing we're trying to achieve here. So, you know, it's not really, it's not as if you have to write an essay about it. And the role of financial advisors, the slides cover it pretty extensively, so, you know, again, it probably wouldn't be worth my while asking a question like this, because you go to that slide, it's one of those cases where the slide does give all the answers. They've got a whole lot of things. But the thing to have in mind, that again, the takeout from this is that financial advisors to project finance, they have to have one thing going for them that maybe in the general run of things it's not necessary, and that is they do have to understand project finance. Because the advice they're giving you is, again, to get you to the point where the lenders say yes. Remember, that's our objective. The bottom line is we want the lenders to say yes to our application for finance. So the lenders, we know, and we'll do it in a few weeks, they go through a fairly detailed due diligence process. So the financial advisors need to know how that works, so that they can ensure that they provide and that the application presents information in the sort of way that is going to be best received. So there's quite a bit more. And as I mentioned last week, when we looked at the Connect East toll road, all of the things that the financial advisors did were fairly much value-adding. And in particular, I mean, we could put numbers around the refinancing part of it. So they recommended, let's set up the usual non-recourse loan, which is the construction loan converting to the permanent loan, and have a contract that says we have to pay off this permanent loan, but then have another contract that supersedes it that says if you get to completion, it's refinanced automatically. Pros and cons of upfront project financing with bonds as opposed to bank syndicate borrowing. So what are the things that make bonds seem good? What are the aspects? Interest rate, fixed and low. I mean, when you're talking project financing, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. That's a good enough reason itself, isn't it? Interest rate, fixed and low. What else? That's the main one, but there are some others, the longer term. Bonds often are longer term than bank loans. And why is that important? Well, if you have to pay off a bank loan in 6 years, but you're expecting to make your cash flows over 30 years, then it puts some fairly heavy emphasis on the first year's operations, and there's quite a bit of pressure on the first year's cash flows, the first 6 years. If you could repay it over 20 years, then that's a much better outcome. You're paying more interest, of course, because the principal's out for longer, but you're reducing the pressure on your early year cash flows. And the early years are probably the times in operation where it is a little bit more risky, because you're just starting up and trying to get to capacity and that sort of thing. Also, a bond is essentially a piece of paper, and that's the contract. If you see a bond, the terms are on the back. If you see a financing agreement, it's this thick. There's hundreds of different terms that you have to abide by if you've signed on the dotted line as the borrower. So less rigorous requirements. What are the cons? So very hard to. That's probably valid. Yeah. Although we'll see a good example where they did. In fact, two examples we'll have where they've issued lots of bonds. So it depends, because theoretically that's the other pro. Huge market of investors, potential investors. You're not just limited to the banks in their capacity as lenders. You've got all of these different potential bond investors, including banks meeting their capital adequacy requirements, and that's all banks, not just the ones that do project finance, or insurance companies, or pension funds, professional bond investors, and so on. So, yes, you may struggle to sell enough bonds, but you may not. What's the big negative? That's a negative. I don't think it would ever be the biggest negative, but that certainly is one of the negatives. It might be a reason for not doing it, to tell the truth. To get the credit rating? Yep, that's a valid con as well, disadvantage. It's still not the biggest one in my view. Yes, and so on that basis you would be making losses on the interest rate spread, yeah, the negative carry that's called. So you get all the money for bonds up front and you start paying interest up front. With a bank loan you draw it down over a period and you only grab it when you need it, and that's when the interest starts. With the bonds you have to put the money somewhere until you need it, and you're not going to get the same interest rate. Deposit interest rates are never higher than borrowing interest rates, except for bank. What's the other one? Okay, that was the point that wasn't made on this side, but you've said it. You've given us more detail around it. That is correct. It's a valid one. What's the main one? So we've got everything in my view, but the main one. You might not get the money. Yeah, you're right. And I suppose maybe that's the point that was made the first time as well. I was thinking more, when you answered, I thought quantum. But in fact, not getting the money because the bond investors only give you an indication, they don't give you a commitment. And then you go through all of the cost and the regulation and so on, and the disclosure, and it takes a long time, and by the time you're now ready to issue the bonds, the investors are not ready. How might sponsors maximise the debt financing outcome? And there's a slide on this as well, and it's things like making sure you've got some competition between the lenders, making sure you providing them information on the things that might be deal breakers, so on and so on. But the bottom line is you need a good project. Describe them and their roles. Well, we just did it today. All right, so I'm introducing risk, and I'm introducing risk at a very user-friendly level, right at the bottom floor, so that we can all go up together. Now, when we think about risk, and I'm not talking just about project finance or even talking about your degree, your master's degree, and the subjects therein, I'm talking about in day-to-day life. When you think about risk, you think about it as something negative. Indeed, the dictionaries tend to take that view, exposing to danger or hazard. But when we study risk in the context of corporate finance, it's a very technical term, and it's a term that says it represents the possibility of deviation between actual and expected returns. Remember, the risk on the returns on a security, if you think about a normal distribution, the expected return is the middle part, the mean, and the dispersion around the mean is the risk, and measured by standard deviation. So really risk is just deviation rather than downside. So in corporate finance there can be both positive and negative risks. So risk is not purely thought of as the possibility of the cause of loss, but more broadly its variability. So that's the standard finance definition of risk. Now, having gone at pains to talk about that, in project finance the only one we're worried about is the one that we find is negative, exposing to danger or hazard. It's the only one we really care about. So the risks that we focus on, the ones that we're going to try and manage when we go through the mitigation process, are any sources of variability that create adverse outcomes. So when you think about it, the risk of interest rate risk, if you're a borrower at variable rates, it actually is two-sided because interest rates can go down as well as go up. But we don't care if it goes down. In fact, we're happy. So we're not going to do anything about that. We're only going to manage the potential adverse impact of upside risk, of upside interest rate movements. So increases in interest rates that cost us more. And the same with things like foreign exchange and so on. Foreign exchange risk could be up or down, and we're only going to take out our hedging positions that protect us from an adverse movement that would cost us more. And that's the focus. So we acknowledge that there's a technical definition of risk, and everyone that does risk management as a job acknowledges it, but they don't actually focus on the variability that's favourable. If that happens, that's a good outcome, and you gladly accept it. So remember, risk, of course, is purely a function of uncertainty in the future. So in terms of the impact on the business, the uncertainty that we're concerned with is future events, future circumstances could result in economic losses being suffered. Now, I think you all know this, but I sometimes feel that if I don't put it all in one place, we don't have a complete appreciation of what could happen. So, broadly speaking, when I'm talking about the economic losses, the adverse impact of risk, what I'm really talking about is some different things. First, a risk event that leads to a loss or reduction of revenues. Now, clearly that's a risk. So what's the risk? Our selling price goes down. That's a risk. If our selling price goes down, we don't get as much revenue. We think, and we've done all our forecasts based on selling oil at $50 a barrel, what happens if it's 40? Then clearly our revenue goes down, in that case by 20%. Increases in expenditure. We've done all our numbers thinking that we're going to pay the labourers $28 an hour, and guess what? When we get to the time where we have to pay them, they're charging $35 an hour. Now that's a risk because those costs have gone up. The other risk, of course, is damage to or destruction of business property or business assets. How can property be destroyed? By fires, earthquakes, floods, theft, malicious damage, acts of war. All of these things could happen. It's a risk that you need to at least assess the likelihood of it happening. So what we need to do for any project, and indeed any business of appropriate scale, is to do a risk identification and a risk analysis, which commences with identification, and once you've identified the risk, you need to assess it and then try and do something to reduce its impact. So in project finance, risk analysis is important in all business, but in project finance, as I've said before, what we do is we specifically focus on risk allocation in project finance. So you identify and allocate particular risk to the party in the project most appropriately placed to bear that risk. Now it sounds a bit of a mouthful. It sounds like, well, it's fairly sort of non-specific, a little bit intangible, but actually it's fairly tangible when you do the thinking. The construction company are the company that are best placed to bear construction risk. So in project finance, we transfer that risk to them under a construction contract. That's all I'm talking about there. So it provides efficient returns based on the risk-reward relationship. We know that the unbreakable law of finance is expected return is a function of risk. So the more risk that you're placing on another party, then they will rightly require more return. So if you're making us take more risk, you need to pay us more. Then we need to mitigate the residual risk, and the residual risk is the risk that stay with the project. And of course, you consciously retain the main business risk in most cases. And even though it's not apparent, it's what provides the limited recourse in the non-recourse SPV structure. But I put the next line bolded because it's straightforward, but it's important to recognise and appreciate the only risks relevant to a project are those to which the project has an exposure. Now I'm going to put up a slide that has 16 risks. Those 16 risks don't all apply to every project. Okay? The only risks that are relevant in project finance are the ones that the project faces itself. So I said before the example of foreign exchange risk. We know how foreign exchange risk arises. You might have a liability to repay in another currency. And if there's an adverse exchange rate fluctuation, you have to repay more in your home currency equivalent. So that's FX risk. But not every project has FX risk. What about those projects that are 100% in one country and all their activity is in one currency? Yes, foreign exchange risk is a thing, but it's not a thing for that project. So the only risk relevant to any project are the ones that they directly have an exposure to. So let's sort of run a question. If you're in the business of power plant operation, what are the risks associated with constructing a new power plant in an emerging country? So a developing country. Remember the first lecture I put up that slide that said, how did they build the Eurotunnel? They dug it. That was the starting point for thinking. How do you build a power plant? How do you construct a power plant? You start building it. So that's already telling you some of the risks, isn't it? What are some of the risks? I've given you building it. So to do with the construction, to do with materials, probably to do with equipment, and so on. What else? Why did I say emerging country or developing country? Political risk. And we'll see that we look at different aspects of sovereign risk, which is the broad category, political risk and country risk and even social risk. Okay, we'll be looking at those sort of things. Yes?
So should we account for risks that we make our project be exposed to a third party? Instead of, I don't know, for example, a power plant might have transmission lines that might cause like a bushfire risk.
Absolutely we do. So that comes under environmental risk or even social risk. Yep, absolutely. We do have to assess the impact of our project on external parties. But why are you constructing a power plant? What are you hoping to achieve? You want money, don't you? What's the risk? Producing enough power, selling enough power? Sorry? Well, return is broadly, but these are elements that impact upon the return.
Right.
So price risk, yeah. The risk of how much can you sell it for? Have you got the infrastructure right between the power plant and the national grid? That sort of thing. Now again, you don't need to know the technicalities, but you probably do need to know on a basic level if you're producing power, it has to go out to the market somehow. How does it do it? It goes down power lines. That's the sort of thinking, that's the purpose of that question, because I've asked that question before I've even described any specific types of risks. So you need to do a risk analysis. Yescom is one of the authors in this area, and Yescom suggests that the risk analysis should be based on, and he calls it a due diligence process. And due diligence it has sort of, a broad meaning, and what it really means is that you gather every piece of appropriate information related to the project, and you start to analyse that information. So once you've got all the information, so you know it's a power plant, you know where it's going to be, you know what size you expect it to be, you know what the local communities are and the environmental issues are, so you start identifying the risk to which the project is exposed. And once you've identified the risks and assessed them, you allocate them to the appropriate parties, and that's what I spoke of earlier. The appropriate parties are the ones that will contractually bear that risk, because that's what they're in the business of doing. Then, once there are risks that haven't been properly allocated, then you have to determine whether or not you can continue on if you've been unable to allocate specific risks. And some environmental risks might be difficult to mitigate, for example. Or sometimes the revenue risk might be difficult to mitigate. So we'll look at some in more detail. So when we talk about doing risk assessment, we talk about doing due diligence, don't fall into the trap of thinking, these are project finance things, because they're not. Every business needs to do its own risk assessment. Every time a company wants to do a new investment, it has to do the risk assessment around the new investment. And due diligence is just a more, I suppose, formal and detailed way of understanding all of the information associated with an initiative. The difference is, with project finance, and I've said it a few times now, the characteristic is that the risk allocation process is what enables us to get to the point where we can apply for the finance. So it's the key to raising debt finance. So like in any business, you need an appropriate tool or methodology to first identify the risks to which the project is exposed, and once you've identified the risks, you need to somehow assess them, quantify them. So what we're going to look at is what's known as a risk matrix, and the reason we look at that is because it enables us to look contemporaneously at both the likelihood of the risk occurring, so the probability of a risk event happening, and estimate the relative seriousness, which is really the potential loss that could occur if the risk event arises. So on this matrix, which is on the next slide, every different risk that you've identified is placed in a cell that enables assessment of all the risks together. So there, this gives you a view, enables you to sort of visually have a look at it. Now, I'm not saying that every project does this, does one of these traffic light type of diagrams. You know, it's probably a little simplistic in a sense, but you do need to be able to represent the results of your risk analysis one way or another. So this is as good as any. But the key elements here are that there are two aspects of the risk, two characteristics that need to be assessed. How likely is it the risk event to happen? And if it does happen, what are the consequences? And it's usually the financial consequences of the economic loss. That's reduced revenues or increased costs or loss of assets. So we've got from insignificant through to catastrophic. Now, if you've got more than 90% chance of a catastrophic outcome, you're just not going to do it. So that's sort of ridiculous. You can see that really the only times that the only projects that you would go into that has the potential for a catastrophic outcome is where it's a very low risk. And that's, day to day. We're talking about things like earthquakes and acts of war, tsunamis, that sort of thing. So that's what would go into that category. Let's think of one that every company every project is subject to, and that's interest rate risk. Because by definition, we're all going to be borrowers. So we're all going to be subject to interest rate risk. So how likely is there going to be an adverse outcome in terms of interest rate risk? Is it going to be in the rare, the unlikely, the moderate, the likely, or the certain? And that's not really certain, it's almost certain. Which category do we think? In terms of the adverse outcome. If you're borrowing at variable rates, what can happen? Interest rates can go up, interest rates can go down, interest rates can stay the same. That's an exhaustive list, isn't it? So they don't usually stay the same, so it's either up or down. So it's around 50-50, isn't it? So it's in probably this area, a bit under 50% chance that you're going to get a bad outcome. I mean, it just makes common sense, doesn't it? So there's an almost 50% chance that interest rates will go up. And we're borrowing hundreds of millions of dollars, so it's not insignificant. It's probably more than 10% of the budget. It might be up to 30% of your, in terms of a budget, in terms of what the monthly costs are. So you've got interest rate risk, and it's sitting about here, in the high. What about foreign exchange? Well, it depends upon what your exposure is. If you haven't got very big foreign exchange transactions, it's probably, even if it's a 50-50 chance again, it's probably here and insignificant. Or if you've got very large, it's here, or I couldn't really conceive of foreign exchange being extreme. But then you've got other risks like your market risks and the selling price risk and your political risk and environmental risks and so on. All the ones that we're going to go on, they all go onto this matrix. And the usefulness of such a matrix is you can tell at a glance which are the risks that you're really going to have to deal with, the ones that have the most likely impact. The ones in the high and the extreme categories. You have to do something about them. So in practice, as I said, I'm not selling that every project will have that particular, traffic light looking diagram, but the objective of whatever you use to assess your risk remain constant, and that is you have to be able to assess the likelihood of the risk event happening and the consequences in economic terms. So the SPV, usually assisted by consultants, prepares the risk assessment, and it's something that's presented and discussed with lenders and reasonably early. Before you've done the formal application for project finance, you say, here's where we're at with our risk analysis. And the reason you want to do that is so that you can straight away zero in on what they're going to have problems with. If they're saying, well, your political risk is very high, our lending mandate is that we don't go into countries with very high political risk unless there's a specific mitigation, and so on. So there's going to be particular potential deal breakers. And the other thing that you find is that in project finance, like in lots of transactions, the parties to contracts have very different objectives and they focus on different things in negotiating. So for example here, the lenders don't really look at the likelihood so much as the potential outcome. Because remember, I'm a lender, from my viewpoint, what I want to ensure is that I get all my money back. So the risks that bother me are the ones that could stop me from getting all my money back. So the ones that are the really big loss items are the ones that we're concerned about. So they don't really focus on the likelihood rather than just the economic impact. So here's another one. It's different on the basis that there's slightly different descriptions, but also there's a numeric example, a numeric value assigned to each category, so that each risk is the product of the two numbers. And that's helpful because it at least gives you sort of some, standard, this is the cut-off point. Any risk that is above 10, we need to do something about straight away, sort of thing. So, it's essentially doing the same thing. Now, I spoke before of what might be in that category. Can you remind me what might be down here in this category? And they called it medium here and not high. Sorry? Wars, yes. That one at least is more, you can anticipate it probably a little better than some of the others. Not every time. But earthquakes, even earthquakes, you can probably do an assessment of the likelihood. Floods, yeah, you can probably do something about that. Let's run with earthquakes. So you bring your risk analysis in, and you've got risks all over this this particular diagram, and you're talking about ones that are sort of, you know, reasonably likely, but you're starting to deal with them, and you're saying, well, this is, and they say, what's this one though? This one's in the severe category. You say, well, yeah, it's in the severe, but it's in the, like, rare, not going to happen. And they say, well, what are you thinking of? We're saying, well, you know, theoretically, everyone's subject to things like earthquakes and tsunamis, no, not tsunamis, earthquakes. So, what happens if there's an earthquake? You know, this is what the lenders are saying, the banker, in their discussion, and you're saying, well, what do you think happens? And they say, well, bear with me. So if an earthquake happened, and you'd only just started operations, or even before operations, and the whole thing was destroyed, how do you pay us back? Well, before operations, no, it would still be limited recourse. So in operations, how do you pay us back if you only just started operation? You say, well, you know, I suppose it's a little bit of a problem, but it's not going to happen. I mean, we put it there because of theoretical risk, and you know, everyone who's doing activity is subject to the same theoretical risk. Everyone in this country is subject to the same risk. So I don't know why you're focusing on it, and the lenders are going, well, you know, because if it happened early in operations, we lose our money, don't we? What are you going to do about it? What do you do about it?
Insurance.
Insurance. It's the only answer. Now, it's probably not a good example of the competitive tension because the answer's there. But what I'm sort of saying is that the lenders will focus on things that you think they shouldn't be focusing on. You've got a great story about all these other risks, and they're focusing on the ones that are just theoretical risks. But their focus is, of course, you know, we've got to make sure that we're protected. And you leave the meeting with the lenders and you're going, geez, what a pack of dickheads, they just don't get it, do they? And the lenders leave the meeting and they say to each other, what a pack of dickheads, they just don't get it, do they? So on two sides of the argument, they think the other guys are just not paying, you know, not focusing on the right things. Okay, so moving on to risk allocation. I've said this a number of times now because it is the most important element of risk allocation. You need to allocate risks. They should be borne by the parties that are best able to manage them themselves. So the risk of late completion of construction and the financial consequences should be borne by the construction company, for example, an EPC contractor. And I've spoken about EPC contractors already, and in practice there's a large, there's a critical mass of these companies that call themselves EPC contractors. So they're conglomerate sort of builders that have then taken over engineering firms, and they've taken over logistics firms and that sort of thing, so they can provide all the materials. But it's not necessarily that you use an EPC contractor. It can equally be just a straight-out construction contract. So who should be bearing the risk? Well, the ones that are doing the construction. Because remember, we're an SPV. And as an SPV, we don't know anything about construction. We're going to pay you guys to do the construction, so you have to bear the risk of construction. And of course, that's how they price their services. We say, can you do this construction of this power plant? And they sit there and they work out they look at the plans, or they do the plans themselves as the EPC, and then they price it all up and they say, well, for us it'll cost us 400 million to do all of this. Let's quote them 600 and see how we go. And you as the SPV, you say, oh, 600 seems pretty steep. And then you say, what about, we would think it was more in the range of 450, you know, maybe 500. And that's obviously, again, the competitive tension. They're trying to get more, you're trying to save more. At the end of the day, you've both got a rough idea of what the fair price is, and you usually end up pretty close to it, unless one party's got a much stronger bargaining position than the other. If the EPC contractor is going to go out of business unless they get a big contract, they might undercut. If they're the only one available and you know it and they know it, then you might have to pay them more. Anyway, as an aside, and it's in italics again, what are the financial consequences? What am I talking about when I say the financial consequences of late completion? Late completion, we're supposed to finish 31 December 2021. It's not going to finish until the end of June 2022, 6 months late. What sort of costs coming? What are the financial consequences? Probably still paying for construction if it's not being finished. Maybe you don't pay them more. Maybe you do. You might be paying for more materials. But they're probably not the main ones because the EPC contractor probably has to wear that. Remember, you've got to start paying back the loan when you get into operations. If you get into operations 6 months late, you've got that big amount of money still outstanding that hasn't been repaid and generating more interest. Remember I said before, our 800 plus 100, we owe 900. We're supposed to start paying that at the start of 2022. No, we can't do it. So the 900 is trickling up to 905, 910, 915 million dollars. So just the extra interest cost. You've engaged the operations and management contractor to start 1 January. Now, they've got a contract that is enforceable. Just because we can't come into the facility doesn't mean we haven't got a contract. You've got to pay us. So you're probably having to start paying contractors even before you can use them in operations. You might have problems with your offtake contracts or something like that. So there's clearly financial consequences. And so you want to say, and this is the idea of risk allocation, you want to have it in the contract with the construction company that if there are delays and it's because you guys didn't get your act together, then you must bear the financial consequences. So how would you transfer it? By paying them less or by penalising them, financial penalties, that sort of thing. Making them meet the extra costs. So the risk is transferred in the contract and says if you cause delays, you need to meet the consequences. There are exceptions, of course, if it's outside the EPC contractor's control, such as a force majeure risk that shut down the construction for a while, then they're not going to be held liable, but that'll be in the contract as well. But at least one way or another, you are ensuring that construction is done and the risk of construction is borne by the construction company. And I said before, they'll price it out. They're experts, they're in the business of construction, that's their risk appetite, that's their business. So they want to do construction projects where it costs them $400 to do and they charge $500. That's their return on their risk, which is essentially the risk of having the expertise, the ability to do the construction. So clearly it's a very important exercise to make sure you choose the appropriate counterparty, the ones that are truly the ones that can bear the risk, each of the risks. So I've already really touched on this and said, well, transfer of absolutely every risk of a project to other parties is usually not viable, but it's not desirable. Because if we're going to be in the business of being a power plant, we want to actually make our returns by producing power and selling it into the market. So we still have to retain essentially the risk of our core operations. If you transferred all those risks out, what's the impact? What will finance theory tell you is the impact of transferring all the risk? Which return? Less is not specific enough. No is probably too strict. No, it's not going to be negative. I don't think so. Yeah, which market rate are you talking about?
Just average price, just the market rate of average price. The average price.
No, look, what you're talking about would be the return on the market portfolio. If you transferred all risk, no, see, the return on the market portfolio is for bearing market risk. The concept of diversification is to get rid of non-market risk, firm-specific or unsystematic risk. So, yes, in portfolio construction, you've got to get rid of unsystematic risk because you're only being compensated for market risk. But here, if you get rid of all of the risk of the project, you're not taking any market risk. Risk-free rate of return. Theory would tell us it's the risk-free rate of return. And why the hell go about doing all this if you're only going to get the risk-free rate of return? As I usually say, I'd rather lie on the couch and watch cartoons, you know, put the money in the bank, get the risk-free rate of return. Rather than do all this, all the work for getting a project together and then transferring all the risks out. So, you know, but the normal principle applies. If you're asking parties to assume more risk, they're going to expect a higher return. So think about the off-takers. The off-takers essentially bear the revenue risk or the market risk or whatever you want to call it, because they're the ones that have contracted to say, we will pay when you start producing. Now, they've got their reasons and their good business reasons, and they're in a good position, usually, the off-takers, because they need that supply of whatever it is you're producing. So they're the appropriate party. But if you say, look, we want you to commit not to 70% of our produce, but 90% of the produce, they're going to say, well, all right, you're putting more market risk onto us, we need to be compensated. Now, in terms of the offtake contract, it's probably compensated by a discount to market price going forward. I think that's the way you'd have to do it. You couldn't directly give them a cash incentive to take on more. But the principle being, any contractor that you want to take more risk, they will demand, rightly, a commensurate return. So, higher risk, yeah. So, just staying with Yeskin, but I don't stay with Yeskin for very long because a lot of his treatment is very sort of broad rather than specific. But he says, okay, well, there's three main categories of project finance risks. He calls the risks commercial risk, and the commercial risks are the ones for doing the project. So if you're doing a power plant, it's the risks around doing the business of constructing and operating a power plant. Then there's macroeconomic risks, and they're the external risks, but you're still subject to them. So inflation, interest rate, exchange rate, in some cases commodity prices, that sort of thing. The market type risks that are in the macroeconomic variables. So if you're running a power plant, you've got the risk of running a power plant, but you've also got the risk that inflation will erode the value of your revenues, or the interest rates will go up on your borrowings, or exchange rates will fluctuate. So these are the in that category. And then he says the other category is political risks associated with where you're operating. So the effects of government action or political force majeure. Force majeure just means unstoppable force. So that's why when we talk about force majeure, we mainly focus on weather events, you know, natural force majeure events, but there's also unnatural, such as politics, like wars and civil disturbance and that sort of thing. So Yeskin talks about these categories, and then he says, okay, for each category, the way that we address our risk analysis is we ask a series of questions that we have to be able to answer. The first is, in terms of commercial risks, he says, well, the starting point is, does the project overall make sense? And in a way, this is it positive NPV? Then he talks about all these different risks. Completion risk, can we complete on time and on budget? Environmental risk, do we face any environmental constraints? Operating risk, revenue risk, input supply risk, force majeure risk, contract risks, sponsor risks. So he's broken it down into a whole lot of different types of risks that we have to address, and he does the same for the other two categories that are identified on the previous slide. So the same sort of questions for the group of macroeconomic risks, the same questions for political risks. Now, So even on that slide, he's come up with a number of specific categories, and right up until this point when we've been talking about risk, we've named a few of them. We've named interest rate risk and exchange risk and environmental risk and market price risk and operating risk and political and country and all of these different risks. But there is no universally accepted list. Just like there is no well-defined and accepted by all definition of project finance, it's, you know, those that are implementing the transaction, it fits with what they're trying to achieve. And it's the same with identifying risks. The risks that are important are the ones that you can identify, and they're categorised on the basis of their differential likelihood of happening and their differential impact. So there's lots of different labels we'll find. But be very clear, you know, so I'm coming back to this, and while I'm saying it now, you'll think that's sort of an unnecessary point because he made the same point 20 minutes ago. And in a way you're right. The key is to identify all risks, however labelled, to which a project is exposed. I occasionally go the repetition sort of strategy on the basis of making you familiar with something because it's important. Okay? So it's important because sometimes the missing link in terms of the understanding is not really sort of saying, all right, I have to be able to look at that and then pick out the ones that are appropriate, rather than go to a list and just dump what's on the list. So I'm going to follow Tinsley's list of 16 risks. The reason is that they essentially cover ones that we see in any of the other sources, but also Tinsley has a good justification in terms of his categorisation. He says that any risk category that can't be clearly linked to a cash flow line is not of much use. And when we're talking about a cash flow line, it's a bit broader than that, but what's the economic impact? And if we can't specify the economic impact, then it's not really going to be helpful in terms of our analysis. So what he's saying, things like commercial risk or business risk or project risk, they're too vague. You can't say, all right, what's the likelihood and what's the potential impact? So you can't assess them rigorously and adequately. So it needs to relate to be the cause of a particular economic loss. So it relates to variable cash flow, and more broadly speaking, as I said, it includes asset losses as well. So here's our list. He used to have a website. It's not up anymore, but it was one of those really crappy old websites that was done in the 1990s and never updated. And he never really gave any reason for why he put the risks in this particular order. And I think it's because it just evolved organically. When he thought of something, he just wrote it down. So he said, all right, well, there's operating risk, but there's actually three types of operating risk. Then there's sponsor/participant risk, engineering, blah, 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 all the way through to legal risk. Now, it's a helpful, or it was a helpful resource in the sense of identifying a lot of different risks and what the ones that can have a differential impact. But it's probably necessary to put them into a different sort of order in the sense of when the risks are likely to arise in the project finance process, so, or the phases of the project. So I'm saying that, well, there's some specific risks that relate to construction period. And those risks are completion risk. So that's the risk of completing the construction. And we'll see that there's actually two aspects of that as we go forward. Then there's the engineering risk, because of course we need the engineering, which is the design of the asset facility, to work, or else we're in trouble. The infrastructure around what we're building. So our main thing in terms of the oil operations, the main assets in the facility are the built structures that do the production, that do the separation and refining and the production. But you also, and also the actual drilling on the wells and that sort of thing. But you need infrastructure in the form of pipelines and linking it all up. Storage tanks are probably an infrastructure asset. Transportation risk he speaks of, sponsor and syndication risk. And these all arise, transportation can probably straddle into operations as well. But sponsor risk and syndication risk, which is the the lending risk, are both up front, because if the risks are not resolved in those, you don't get the project going. Then there's a whole group of risks that I would argue are ongoing. They start in construction phase and they're all still going in operations. And that is, of course, interest rate risk, because even if you're in the repayment of the loan cycle, you're still subject to interest rate risk because the loan repayments change every time the interest rate changes. Foreign exchange, especially if you're doing some of your activities in foreign currency, sourcing some of your inputs or so on. Environmental risk starts when you start construction, goes into operations. So do country, political, social risk, force majeure risk could happen at any time. Legal risk can happen at any time. More likely to be in the construction phase, but you're going to have contracts going forward as well. And then there's risks that are typically, you'd say, they're only going to be risks that you consider in the operating phase. So the operations are where you generate the return to the stakeholders, enough to repay the lenders and leave a residual return to the equity holders. So that's the market risk, and the market risk really is the revenue risk. Another type of revenue risk in specific projects is known as supply risk. And then there's the operating risk, the risk of running the operations, making sure that the operating costs are kept to the budget level, making sure that the revenue and production are at the budget level. But one thing you need to also appreciate is that risk is not static, and certain risks will be more or less relevant in different projects at different times. So let's start with completion risk. And when we think about completion risk, we think about, well, what are we trying to achieve? Project lenders, and indeed all parties, if they decide to proceed with financing a project, their expectation is that the loan proceeds are spent on building the project. As we said before, they contribute 800, we contribute 200. That $1 billion is spent on building the project as we've said in the plan. And it's going to be delivered on time and on budget, because there's been a lot of thinking done, and if they don't think it can be delivered on time or on budget, they will push you to change your budget. So we've got to the point where everyone agrees with the timeline and the cash budget, and everyone agrees that once we've finished once we've finished construction, then it's going to produce the cash flows that have been forecast. Now, no one's naive enough to think it's going to produce to the dollar, but everyone thinks that's a reasonable estimate, that's the best estimate, and it's usually, in most cases, the lenders and the sponsors like to have it slightly conservative. We're going to commit to producing 20,000 barrels a month. We think, or a week, or a day, whatever it is, a day probably. We think we can actually do 30, but let's commit to 25 for the purposes of the project budget. So once it's happening, it'll repay the loan comfortably. Now, everyone that goes into the project finance transaction have done so much work getting to a plan that they think is doable that everyone expects this to happen. So completion risk, which we also call construction risk or cost overrun risk, it's the risk relating to the first part, that the project is delivered on time and on budget. At the extreme, if the project structure is never completed, we never have a project. We never begin operations, we never generate cash flows. So that's the extreme risk. Now, completion risk is generally not taken by financiers in project lending. Why is that? Why don't they take completion risk? This is one of the unfair questions. That's a correct statement per se, which I suppose means that maybe the question hasn't been asked as well. But the lenders won't expose themselves to completion risk, and the way they do it is by having the limited recourse structure. So if the project never completes, you never get to the trigger that goes non-recourse, so it stays recourse with the sponsors. That's what, in fact, that's the economic outcome of the limited non-recourse arrangement, and that is that during construction, the contingent recourse is there. So the lenders, they're lending to the project for construction, but really the only risk they're taking is operational risk. They're taking the risk that the future cash flows won't pay them back. They're not going to take the risk that you don't even get to future cash flows. I think I said it before, in a way it's the paradox of project finance pricing, the debt pricing, because they're not even taking this special risk, but they're charging everyone more. It's because they can. And I suppose it's the deferral premium as well. But that really should be quantified into the premium that's charged. Anyway, I'm sort of moving away from the whole point. The way that the loan transaction is structured means that they actually aren't exposed to construction risk. It's a pain in the arse for them to get their money back, but they get it back. Well, they should be able to. So clearly, completion risk is at a serious end for the sponsors of the SPV. What we find, though, is that the extreme of completion risk, where the construction starts but it's abandoned without completing, it's really quite unusual. Non-completion of the asset structure, usually they don't spend sort of 800 million of $1 billion and then say we can't actually get it done, we'll walk away. Now the reason for that is that if the price goes up, and I've touched on this last week, if there's it costs more to finish it, it's still better to finish it and maybe finish it as a negative NPV project, because that negative NPV will be much lower than the negative NPV of walking away and repaying 800 million for nothing. So it's far more common. The completion risk comes about not in non-completion but cost overruns. So the main completion risk is cost overrun risk. So the cost to complete exceeds, and sometimes we'll see next week when we look at trying to mitigate this, some of the outcomes have been horrendous in terms of how much it costs to get to completion. So even though it's called completion risk, the main risk is the risk of cost overruns. And the problem relates to how the extra costs are funded. And we did touch on this last week when I said, okay, if our $1 billion project ends up, it's going to need 1.2 to complete, where did the extra money come from? Well, it's often extra equity. And I've spoken about the fact that it's a reduced NPV just on the basis of doing the WACC calculation. It increases the discount rate. Extra debt might not be available. Even if it is, it'll be on less favourable terms in relation to the interest rate that they'll charge and also the seniority. So the new debt will come in over the top of the old debt. Also in terms of maturity, they'll probably make it shorter term and be more strict on you. So cost overruns are to be avoided if possible. So the risk is associated with the accuracy of your project cost forecast. If you get your forecast right, then you raise the right amount of money. Be conservative. But it's a balancing act, because if you're too conservative, it costs too much, you might not get your rate of return. It might not be positive NPV. But this is a theme that repeats, and we're going to look at a lot of projects and we think, why have they got it so wrong? How did they get it so wrong? And part of the reason is inexperience in terms of doing cost forecasts. You know, there's probably those projects where there's slabs of the forecast that someone did it on day one of the spreadsheet and no one ever changed it because they didn't really want to focus on that. They said, all right, those are the right numbers. So YESCOM talks about, well, what drives completion risk? And it's really, you know, again, this is fairly straightforward, but it gives you an idea of the elements of completion risk. And they include the site acquisition, the access to the site, there's risk associated with that, risk associated with the permitting from the government, clearly risk associated with the contractor, the construction contractor, cost overrun, but I don't think that's a separate category. I think it's around all of these. It can be mitigated if there's revenue during construction. That's not common, but it can happen. delays, of course, and so on. Inadequate performance of completion. Kingsley doesn't think that is completion risk. So why don't we take our break now and come back with some more discussion on completion itself rather than completion risk. 6:44, I'll start talking again at 6:55. I got my wife a shock money in Shenzhen. I went to Shenzhen last year, and they had their evidence on the real thing. But that one looks nice. You go to Japan for shopping, do you? You go to Japan for shopping? Okay, let's start again. Now, I've referenced the concept of completion a few times, and completion is that that state that has been met in terms of triggering the contingency in the debt agreement. So if you've met completion, you have met the condition for the loan going non-recourse. So it's at the end of construction, but there are different types, and it's again project specific. So completion itself is different from completion risk, but of course it's one of the drivers of completion risk. So the different types of completion are physical completion. Now, when you first thought about, oh, it has to be completed, and then into operations, and then it goes non-recourse, then you most likely would have thought that means they have to finish the building. They have to finish all the construction. And you're right, that is one aspect of completion. That's physical completion, it's done. But in terms of project finance, recall that the lenders want to be sure as they can be, that the project is going to be able to repay them. So just physical completion usually isn't enough. So what they often require is what's known as mechanical completion. So that shows you that the operations happen. So the project can actually produce the oil or the electricity or whatever it is that the project's been set up to do for a specified period of time. And then in recent times they've also said, well, even if it's producing, it needs to produce the right cash flows. So it needs to generate a certain level of revenues, or produce it under a certain unit cost, or for a specified period of time, and or meets different financial ratios, and so on. So there's different aspects that are going to be specified, and they're the ones that the lenders will determine are the most relevant in terms of giving them a high level of comfort that the project will be able to generate sufficient cash flows to repay the debt. So, to ensure that everyone knows when completion has happened in a particular case, there's what is known as completion tests. So, satisfying the non-recourse trigger means that there have to be completion tests. They're objective on the basis that it's not that the lender says you've met it or the SPV says we've met it, that a third party verifies that the test has been met. So a completion test, the definition is it's a step-by-step evaluation of a completed project's ability to, 1, meet design specifications, so that essentially lines up with physical completion, and then 2, perform as planned, which essentially lines up with mechanical completion on the previous slide, and 3, generate the expected cash flows, so that lines up with financial completion. So once you've met the completion test, and we say it in the singular, but there's usually more than one, once we've met completion test, the project then officially moves from recourse financing, which is the construction loan, to non-recourse financing, which is the permanent loan that needs to be repaid. And so if there's any restrictions that are in place to maintain the limited recourse, they go away. That's what that last point is. I'll get onto that more later. So what we actually find in practice, what we observe, is that project finance completion tests are more extensive than just physical completion of the asset structure. Now this is in contrast to other commercial activities, such as if there's like an apartment block. Usually, and there's a financing associated with the apartment block, usually the recourse condition is just the apartments are finished. So they send in the quantity surveyor or whoever who goes into apartment 1, looks around, yep, good. Goes into apartment 2, looks around, yep, he's got a big keychain, a big ring of keys. Goes into apartment 3, 4, and goes into every apartment, rings up the bank and says it's complete, physically complete, and that is the trigger for non-recourse in those particular types of contracts, construction contracts. In project finance, it's usually not enough. In the early days it was, but then lenders found that, in fact, oh well, it all looked good, but it didn't operate well. So we need some more assurance. And so the financiers are saying, well, this is what we need to see before we're very confident that we'll be repaid. Now, they can't say operations for 2 years or something like that, because that's, that's just too much. You have to get into operations and then have the completion test reasonably quickly, usually within 3, 6, maybe sometimes 12 months. And so they recognise the likely areas of risk, and they set up a test to make sure that you're operating to overcome the risk. And the other element of this is that sponsors have also become a little bit more sophisticated. And so if a sponsor is negotiating with a relatively inexperienced lender, what they try and do is negotiate very limited completion tests by saying, okay, so completion is when we finish the building, okay? Construction. And if the lender's unsophisticated, they might say, that sounds fair. That's what always happens. But these days, so the sponsors try and shed their risk by getting to non-recourse as quickly as possible. So the completion test, this is another one of these lists. It's a very good summary slide, but not a good one-size-fits-all slide. So, continuous operations for X consecutive months. Guys, I don't want to see X on an exam. You all laugh here, but I see it too often. So, it's just, it's the people in here, isn't it? You didn't listen, did you? If I explain this, maybe I haven't. So I've got these microphones here and they record the lectures. And so when I tend to hit the microphone and talk about it, I'm talking to the people that are listening to this for the first time 2 days before the final exam. Good luck with that. So, yeah, you have to be sort of, and you haven't got experience, and in fact I haven't got very much direct experience in this, but continue operation for X consecutive months, put a number in it. 24, 36 is too much, because you can't keep the sponsors on the hook with limited recourse while it's up and running and operating. So it has to be something sensible like 3 or 6. 90% can be some other percentage. Design, production or throughput or whatever. So depending on what it is. Reserve life greater than X years. Again, these are the sort of mistakes you can make if you treat this as if I'm asked about completion tests, all I have to do is write down a couple of these. The only time reserve life is relevant is in a natural resources project, because that's the only time where the reserves of resources is part of what you're trying to develop for your project. Achieving a defined operating cost per unit, specified product, specialised outputs, sales completion test, I've linked here. Present value of cash flows, greater than, for example, 150% of loan outstanding. Again, it's just the example. It might be a different number. Or meeting financial covenants on working capital and so on. Minimum quality or quantity outcomes. Basically, it's the lender saying, what are the important things that have to happen in this project for us to be comfortable that it will generate cash flows over a long period to repay us. Now, I said in terms of resources development, and I did talk about natural resources a little bit last week, just so that you can eyeball what I'm talking about. This is hydrocarbons, and this is a representation of what might be under the ground. Now, I told you about what we used to do is seismic acquisition, and seismic basically, this is on water, so you'd have to do marine seismic, which means that you had to essentially make vibrations here on the seabed that send vibrations down, and then when they vibrate back up, it's on an angle, and you capture it in your what are known as not microphones, something else phones. What are they? Hydra? Yeah. Maybe. It's not ringing a bell with me. Here's me, I was in this business for years, and we're talking about every second day, the particular recording equipment, I can't remember. But it's just, they are like microphones, they capture the vibrations, and from the vibrations, you're able to get a mapping of the subsurface structure. What this is showing you here is typically representative. So you've determined that you think there's an oil reserve here, and that's what you drill down to. So, this is what determines where you put the oil well. Often, as I said, the oil and gas are together, and the gas is higher because it's lighter, so it goes to the top. And often there's water there, and that's what traps the oil, because the reservoir rock, it can actually seep through the reservoir rock, and sometimes it's hard enough to hold it. And that's sort of a formation based on the formation below the surface. Here is oil's been trapped by a fault movement. But the point, I thought I'd just put this in for interest's sake, but the point I'm illustrating from the previous slide is, look, firming up the completion test that says reserve life of greater than X years is only going to be relevant to this sort of project. So there's a reserve there, and the reserve has been estimated by the seismic activity, but the way the industry works is you don't actually have a good idea of exactly what the reserve capacity is until you start drilling into it. Once you've accessed the reserve, you've got a much better idea of what's available, what the true size of the reserve is, what's extractable, that sort of thing. So then, if you've said, think about the forecast. The forecasts say, all right, we think there's 100 million barrels of oil down there that we can extract. We think we can extract 10 million barrels a year. So that's saying that it's a 10-year reserve life. 10 million barrels a year for 10 years is the 100 million barrels. So you've put in your plan, it's a 10-year reserve life. And that implies how many barrels they are because of how much you're going to extract. Then, once you've started operations, you can go down here and put in the equipment that then reads better the underground structure, and you come back and you say, yes, it is at least 10 years, or no, it's not. And if it's not, you're in trouble, because you don't meet the completion test. So there's all those different types of completion tests. And the same word relates to the physical state of completion. It also relates to the risk of completion and the tests that determine the physical state of completion. So they're all related to one another, but I have found in the past there's been confusion around it. And some of the exam technique, of course. If I say what's the significance of completion, the answer is not to describe completion risk. The significance of completion is that it is the point at which the loan goes non-recourse. And how do we know when there's completion? We have to have met completion tests. So completion relates to the end of construction, but the end is dependent upon the project specific. It depends upon when you've met the tests. But in broad terms, construction's finished and project's ready to operate. And when formal completion happens, that's when the loan goes non-recourse. Completion risk then is that group of risks that might prevent completion being achieved. Or if it doesn't prevent completion, it's the risks that mean it costs a lot more, the cost overrun risk. And completion tests are the standards that are applied to confirm completion has occurred. So they're objective tests because once a third party says, yes, that's been met, then that's a certification that the lender has to rely on and then say, all right, you formally met the non-recourse condition. So the completion tests are agreed between the borrower and the lender, the SPV and the lender, and as I indicated a little earlier, if you're an SPV and you've got a bit of experience in this area, what you're trying to do is have limited and easy completion tests. What the lender wants to achieve is having completion tests that give them a very strong, not understanding, but a strong level of comfort that the cash flows can be generated. So in the past, when it used to be just physical completion, as I've said, some lenders got burned because, wow, it looks fantastic, it's all finished, great, tick, it's now non-recourse. Then they push the button and nothing happens. Oops, it looked really good, but something stopped it from actually operating. So the lenders are saying, well, we're not going to take that risk, we're going to wait until you push the button and see what happens. And more to the point, when it all flows out and you start selling into the market, we're going to make sure you get the cash flows. We'll see a good example of completion tests in the first case study. Here's a multiple choice question, and it's perhaps a little unfair at this point in time because we haven't quite done enough on the different projects, but if you have a look at this, and this is straight off an exam. In fact, the only downside of me putting it here is it's quite a question that I like. I prefer to put it on the exam. So it's about the level that I go with. Which of the following would not be an appropriate completion test for an independent power plant project? Why C?
Because it's just on paper, it's just a bunch of numbers on paper.
Yeah, I reckon that's a valid completion test. C was the most wrong answer because the people that had a superficial understanding thought it should be 150. Now the numbers here, the X's and the percentages and that, they're all subject to negotiation. If you have a superficial understanding and you look at this and you go, aha, 140, no, that should be 150. Again, you all laugh. Did you hear all the laughter? But truly, you know, so every time I talk like this, it's the same thing. It's don't have a superficial understanding, have the ability to make the connection. So in this case, no, present value of cash flows, if you can do it, is a valid test. But I don't think it's a very common one, to tell the truth, because how do you actually work out present value of cash flows? In some, if you've got very strong offtake contracts, perhaps. But it is a valid test, though. Physical completion of the power plant, well, surely that's, you know, that's a minimum requirement. So physical completion, yes, that's a valid test. Continuous operations, is 4 months okay? Very confident nods here in the front. Absolutely. You're correct. So what do we reckon it is? We're down to D and E. Why? Absolutely. Very good answer. Okay, so you're really at a good level already. If you looked at this and you were able to answer that, you're at a good level. Okay? As I said, I think it's a little unfair in the sense that we haven't looked at a lot of these things. What I did last semester was I changed independent power plant to oil operations. And what does the answer become? That's a very good answer. It's B. The answer becomes B because it's not a power plant. So in a sense, there's always going to be, to any project, continuous operations is probably a valid completion test. Present value forecast is probably valid, although I do concede I don't think it's a common one. And satisfying financial covenants, that could be in any project. So usually it turns on the specifics of what type of project it is. Okay, so moving on. So that's completion risk, and completion risk is, in its cost overrun sense, probably the one you're most worried about up front, at least in terms of the ones in construction period. In operations, you're worried about revenue risk. So engineering risk relates to the design and construction of the asset and the whole asset facility. And the reason I keep putting up slides to show you the complexity, and we went through the oil operations project, is there's a lot of scope for making engineering or design errors in a lot of these things. So you have to be very careful in relation to the engineering. And how can you be careful if you're an SPV and you have no expertise in engineering design? Well, you have to mitigate the risk somehow, and we'll talk about mitigation next week. Now, Tinsley says that it's a poorly understood risk, and it's often considered part of completion risk. And in fact, Yescom listed it as one of the things that relating to completion risk. But Tinsley said, well, no, it's because it's specifically not the cost overruns and all of the issues that arise in completion risk. The problem with engineering risk is it doesn't work because you haven't got the design of the technical facility, the technical equipment right. So, and you only realise that when you get to the point where you push the button and nothing happens. Oh, it's not working, but it's all here, it all looks great. Something went wrong. Something in the hopefully it's just a programming error or something like that. But it might be the physical equipment is not fit for purpose or whatever. It might be that the way they put the whole facility together doesn't quite work. one engineer did the offshore design, one engineer did the onshore design, and they actually didn't marry up how it was supposed to connect. So the risk here, the engineering risk, is that you've got poor quality engineering or design work. And how can you get poor quality? Typically just poor professional advice, and the example I just gave is pretty poor if you don't marry up each of the elements of the process. But it might be because you get an inappropriate or inexperienced firm for the technology or the location. So you might have a firm that's really good at this particular technology, but because of the extra demands of the location you're going to, and they're not aware of it, they could not adjust the technical design to meet with the physical requirements of the new location. An example that I often give is when you're drilling for offshore oil and you have to construct oil platforms, the platforms that you construct off northwestern Australia in a tropical zone are quite different from the platforms that you construct in the North Sea, which is subject to freezing in winter. So, you know, if you're a really good platform constructor in Australia and they send you up to do the North Sea, you've got to take into account what the differences are because they're going to have a bearing or poor estimates. So it's another risk that can have a serious impact on cash flow. First, in relation to cost overruns, because you might have to spend money to fix it before you get to completion. But even if you get to completion and it's just not working to capacity, you'll never make your revenues. So here's an example of engineering risk. Again, it's one of these examples I use that is broader than just the issue at hand. So it can be at the serious end, particularly when it involves new technology or an existing scale of significant technology. Here's the example. Cominco is a Canadian lead and zinc producer. Cominco today announced, so it's an announcement to the market, so it's going to have a share price impact, that it had abandoned any hope of restarting its new lead smelter, which is the operations for producing lead. It's been shuttered for 3 years because of production problems. So it was a new smelter, and they'd had to shut it up. So today's announcement is that it's not going to restart it. It's been shut for 3 years. We were hoping to restart it, we're not going to. We also announced that we're considering converting the smelter to a more promising smelting process, which would cost an estimated 100 million Canadian, and it might seek compensation from the manufacturer of the smelter. Okay, so have a read of that again, those two, the bottom two paragraphs. Have a think about it. Remember, I'm talking about announcement effects. What can we reasonably assume is an outcome? So the two bits of the announcement is that they've confirmed they're not going to reopen it. They shut it down because it was a dud. We've paid for this new smelter, it's a dud, we've shut it down. But we're thinking of an alternative, and we're also thinking of suing the people that sold us the dud. What's your answer? Following the announcement, the price of Cominco shares A went up, B went down, C stayed the same, D, there is insufficient information. Who thinks A? There's one person, two people that were brave enough to say A. Who thinks B? Lots of people think B. So I'm going to ask someone from each group, and if you haven't put your hand up, I'm just going to randomly assign you to a group. So the people that haven't yet put their hand up think it's C or D. Who thinks it'll stay the same, C? Ooh, no C's? Who thinks it's D? I've got a front row of people that didn't put their hand up. So I'm going to assume that you thought it was C or D and ask you to explain it. Gentleman here, who said A? Two people have already answered today. You put your hand up first. Why do you think the price went up?
Because the announcement provides new decision of use smelter, so I think it's like good news. It's like a new chapter, I think, because it just confined the assumption that it would abandon the old smelter. So I think it would already reflect the price. So that's I think we will plan on.
Very good answer. If that was worth 5 marks, I'll give you 5. Who said B? Because?
Yeah. Instead of we doing down, because the first part of the information is that the discussion process is finished. So that's kind of immediate news that's straight away. The other stuff is more, they're hoping to shift conversation. They're hoping to transform the discussion with their future things that may happen or may not. And you're more likely to see.
Excellent answer, 5 out of 5. Now, someone in the front row was saying C. Why do you think it stayed the same? You think D maybe? D. Okay, I'll come back to you for D. Young lady next to you. Any arguments for why it stayed the same? You think it's D as well? Okay, I'm very happy to come back to the both of you. You said B, but you can argue for C?
Yeah, I can give a go to justifying C, which they have already announced closing of their first try, which is a bad thing. And they're offering on the other side a promise of a new process. So I'm just balancing these two positive and negative arguments. Just stay the same because investors are uncertain about.
Okay, so that's a stay the same, so that's another 5 out of 5 answer. So far we've got 3 answers out of 4 that I've given full marks. Go figure. All right, gentleman in the front here, you said you think it's D?
Yeah, so the first paragraph, they said they give up the hope to reopen the smelter. So it has been taken by the market, so the price has been reflect the information. And the second paragraph, they said that they were considering to converting the smelter, so it's only in the air. They haven't decided the situation whether they will reopen it or adapt new technology. So
And so you've concluded from that uncertainty that there's not enough information?
yeah.
But you've used the information quite well. So I would have thought one of the other 3 conclusions was appropriate. But I'm giving you 5 out of 5 for trying. And giving at least sensible... I don't think your conclusion is right, but your analysis was good. Okay, so look, the reason I make the point that A, B, C or D was acceptable answers is because in the real world it could be any of those. I think it's probably B for the reasons given, but let's deconstruct it a bit. Remember, informational effects, announcements are either good news, bad news or no news. In this case, what muddies the water is you could have perceived some as good and some as bad. Or you could have perceived some as no news. Now in this case, my view is it's been shut for 3 years, it's probably no news. But it might be bad news. It's not good news. But here, you could, the ones that argue that it's potentially good news, you could say, well, this good news offsets that bad news. But then when you look at more, and again, I only gave you, maximum 30 seconds to have a look at it, and I've spent lots of time thinking about it. When companies use terms like considering a more promising process, I mean, they're in the business of lead smelting. Surely they can be a little more specific. It's not as if they got to the point where they're keeping proprietary secrets, because they need to tell the market what they've been doing for 3 years. So more promising is weasel words, what they call weasel words. They're trying to sell you a story that isn't happening. That's one. And secondly, they might seek compensation. I mean, these guys fucked us up 3 years ago. If we could sue them, we would have sued them 3 years ago. Or 2 years and 9 months ago, after our lawyers went through everything and ripped them to shreds. Clearly, the week after it happened, the lawyers came in and said, ooh, hate to say this, but your contract doesn't cover this. So this was a legal risk as well as an engineering risk. In my view, but think about it. If someone says, I've just spent all this money on this huge construction, I'm going to sue them for every last cent. You're not going to take 3 years and then 3 years later say, oh, I might sue them. It doesn't make logical sense. Okay, so I think the better view is that B was the answer, but there are interpretations, and all of the interpretations that were given to me were good ones, which is why I'd mark it that way. Now, I have to overlay this with the caveat that, so in the real world, any of these could be right. On a final exam, the multiple choice questions, there's only one right answer, unfortunately, in every case. There's one that's the most right. So, for example, the multiple choice we did 10 minutes ago, there was only one right answer. If I ask it in a non-multiple choice context like this, then I'm probably sort of getting you to make arguments for, you know, more than one of the alternatives. Okay, so just picking up on the concept of technology and the sort of technology that needs to be designed at a very high level, at a very sophisticated level in most cases. In project finance, the lenders prefer proven technology. And the reason they prefer proven technology is that their due diligence team can say, yes, that works, and it works every time. Everyone else is doing it, and that's what works. If there's new technology, it's harder to assess, and it's more risky. And indeed, the empirical evidence suggests that it hasn't been successful. There have been failures due to using new technology. Now, BHP, unfortunately, were party to a couple of them, but the Airbus 380 was a failed project financing. It was a bit of a different one, but it was, even though they got off the ground, although I understand recently they're going to be shut down again, aren't they? Airbus 380 going out of commission, is that right? Maybe I misread. Anyway, it doesn't matter the story. The story here is that you could say, well, but I've seen Airbus 380s, I've been on them, blah, blah, blah. Yes, they did eventually come into the market, but as a project financing, the ones that financed them lost a lot of money. But of course, if you do have a new technology that gives you the jump on your competition, then it could be a huge payoff. So the incentives for sponsors to project finance new technology are fairly high, because when you think about it, project finance minimises their equity risk, and so they can sort of try the new stuff, which is risky, at a lower risk for themselves. But generally the lenders won't let it go by. Okay, the next type of risk that is important and relevant in the construction phase is infrastructure risk. And I'm not talking about where the core asset is an infrastructure asset like a toll road. I'm talking about all of the non-core assets, and we saw a lot of them in the oil operations project, pipelines, storage, etc., etc. So they're still important aspects, but they're the non-core assets, they're the non-operational assets. So office buildings, fencing, roads, electricity supply. These are all necessary for the project, and you're going to have to spend capex on them, but they're not the operational equipment, so they're not directly subject to engineering risk. Important component of most projects though. Now sometimes they will have some degree of technology, and so you need to basically ensure that the infrastructure will be appropriate for the life of the project. In a sense, in that case, there's a bit of an overlap with design risk. So again, we look at this so that we can get a feel for what are the risk points here? Well, they're everywhere. Just making sure that these things work and they all link up and they're all doing what they're supposed to do. There's a whole lot of areas where there could be engineering design, and I've sort of, look, technically they're probably different, but in terms of putting a project together, it's really the same process. Or infrastructure risks. Now, Tinsley includes transportation risk. He says it's it could be seen as part of the infrastructure risk, but I think it's sufficiently different to call it a different risk. He says that, well, really transportation is it's ancillary to the core asset. It's not the production facility and the core activity of production. It's what supports the production, like the infrastructure supports the production facility. I think that you can probably split it out as another source of risk. It doesn't really matter whether or not you're doing it, but it's the risk in terms of road transport of raw materials and building materials and the equipment and that sort of thing. So there's a risk associated with all of that. And also, this one really straddles the other phase as well in some projects. There's risk associated with transportation out of the production. A related risk is if you need to use export facilities, and with lots of natural resources you do need export facilities, and usually port export. Because think about it, how do you transport oil and gas in large quantities? Like, you could put some on the trucks and drive it around, but it depends on where you are and where you want it to go to. You're not going to put it on aeroplanes, so you really have to use shipping. So it might be, if you're going to do a large-scale project in a fairly remote area, you might, the port that's available might not have the capacity to bring in the tankers of the size that you need, for example. I see container ships, but they're not necessarily container ships. Okay, so that's sort of a risk that relates to the construction period. Looking at different ones that start in the construction period and probably are concentrated in the construction period, up front, you might consider that there's a risk associated with the sponsors themselves, especially if one or more of the sponsors, the participants, is weak, either financially or technically. They might not be able to meet their obligation that they've agreed to bring to the project. So if there is a weak or inexperienced participant, then the risk is that they might not meet obligations in terms of equity contributions or technical support or so on. So up front, there's an agreement between the sponsors on the split of equity, and we'll all contribute our equity in a year's time when it's ready to go. And then you roll forward a year later and one of them says, oh, we haven't got the money. In my view, that's a pretty low level risk. Not that it mightn't happen, but if it's possible or if it's likely to happen, it's very easy to anticipate. Think of a sponsor group where there's 3 multinationals and 1 small local company. And the 3 multinationals say to the small local company, we'll put in 100 million each and you put in 10 million. And they know you haven't got 10 million. They're hoping you will in a year, but if you haven't, we'll deal with it. So that's why I think it's at the low end of the scale. But there is a different type of participation risk that might be relevant to large sponsors. And it's actually, it's the risk that if you've met completion, the project has met completion, you've gone to operations, so it's non-recourse. The sponsors don't have to worry because the operations are servicing the debt, and if there's a problem in operations, then that's a problem between the SPV and the lenders and not us. However, if that does happen, some large sponsors say, oh, look, legally we don't have to do anything about it, but reputationally it's a bad look. So if one of our projects fails, maybe we should stand behind it and prop it up, at least get it running again and make any repayments to the bank, because we don't want to lose our good relationship with Morgan Stanley and Deutsche Bank and BNP and all these big banks in the syndicate just because one of our projects is a dud. Yes, everyone knows, everyone's on the same page, legally there's no obligation, but you know, we're going to be a bit gun shy to lend to you guys again next time you do a project because this one failed. So there's no legal obligation. So be clear on the point that this risk is associated with protecting reputation. And some financiers, and also even some rating agencies, they know that the big multis aren't going to be associated with a high-profile failure. So they know that the big multis will probably prop it up. And therefore they make their decision based on the fact that the non-recourse is really only in words. If push came to shove, there will be a little bit of recourse. And this might be one of the reasons why financially strong sponsors say, I don't really need the project finance because even if it goes non-recourse, I'll still have to support it. Just reputationally, I can't live with, I can't be seen to not support it. Moving on to the other element of risk in operations, and it's the other side. The first one was in relation to the equity contributions, the second's in relation to the debt contribution. And it's the same sort of thing. In a syndicate of lenders, then each of them have said, I've used the example before, there's the lead arranger that says I'll put in 100 of the 800, brings in 700, and 7 others who each say we'll put in an average of 100 million. So you've got your 800 ready to be drawn down over the construction period. What if one or more of those lenders either decides not to, or in fact goes out of business? The funding itself has risks because, one or more of the syndicate members doesn't fulfil their commitment. Now again, I don't think it's a very big risk for 2 reasons. One, because the lead arranger, in fact, by signing the mandate letter, has effectively underwritten the full amount anyway. So for the project, it's not a big risk, because one way or another you're going to get it out of the syndicate. It might mean that the lenders have to each put in more, and they mightn't want to do it, but they have to do it because there's the obligation. Again, I don't think it's a big risk because it's just covered in the syndication agreement. So they're the ones that I would argue that they're pretty much all focused in the construction phase. So what are the big construction risks? The big construction risks are completion or cost overrun risk and potentially engineering risk. I think the other ones are probably minor, the infrastructure down through to the lending risk, the syndicate risk. Not such huge risks in general, on average. Of course, you might come to one project that the biggest risk is sponsor risk. Unusual, but it might be the case. And then we've got these risks that start in construction phase, but they persist through to operations. And as I said, with interest rate risk, clearly the interest rates, a variable interest rate can fluctuate from the moment you first draw down to the moment you make the last repayment. Tinsley calls it interest/funding risk, but in fact he's only talking about interest rate risk. So it's as a result of the fact that you're subject to a variable rate in most project finance arrangements. What happens if the loan's at a fixed interest rate? Well, this goes away to an extent. I suppose the only real risk is that if interest rates all go down, you've locked in a higher interest rate. So there's sort of an economic cost there. But it's probably not as bad as actual increasing the interest expense. So, as I'm sure you all understand, if interest rates rise to a significant degree, then the available cash flow, the amount that is required to service the debt, goes up. So the frustrating thing about being exposed to this sort of risk and other market risks is you can be operating perfectly. You can do everything right. Every day you come in and you're producing 10% above what you said you would in terms of the budget, and you're making sure you can control costs. So in fact, your net margin goes up. So it's a really good outcome. It should be a really good outcome for the equity holders. But in fact, something that is completely out of your hands, interest rates go up and it blows your cash flows out of the water because of your huge exposure to interest rates. The whole transaction has been set up on huge amounts of debt. So that's a bad outcome. Corresponds to a reduction in free cash flows, and it could get to the point where you don't have enough to service the debt, and that's when it's really serious. Now, he said interest and funding risk, and then he focused on interest rate. Is there a funding risk as well? Some sources say, yes, of course there's a funding risk. It's the risk of not getting enough. Not getting enough funds. Now, I would argue that it's really a funding risk is really just a function of other risks that we've identified. For example, the risk of not getting enough equity funding is a sponsor risk. And the risk of not getting enough debt funding, once it's been agreed, is a syndicate risk. Of course, the other aspect is one that we've already covered a few times up to this point, and that is where the debt providers haven't agreed on the full amount. So they'll say, we'll give you less, we'll fund this project, but not to the extent you want it to. So that's an upfront risk, not an ongoing risk in that case. And what do you do? We've already discussed it. Do you bring in more debt? Do you bring in more equity? Or do you change the project to fit the amount of debt that's available? Now, in the latter case, you probably have to change all of your cash flow forecasts as well. So if you're going to reduce the scale of production, for example, clearly it's going to change all of your operational forecasts. And usually that's not a viable option because it's the same problem. If all of your cash flows, say the lenders say in our oil project, we're not going to offer, provide 800, we'll provide 650 maximum. And the equity holders say, well, we only want to put in 200, so instead of having $1 billion available, we have 850. Oh, we better scale down everything so that we only spend 850. But if you're scaling down everything, you're scaling down future revenue forecasts, you go back to the lenders and say, oh, we're not going to give you 650 for that. and it would get into a bit of a loop. So changing the project's usually not the answer. It's more debt or more equity. And we have spoken about that. We've spoken about the implications of that. Foreign exchange risk, as we know, occurs as a result of exposure to cash flows in different currencies. And that's going to happen if you're doing cross-border transactions. You might be doing some of your funding in different currencies, your expenses in different currencies to your revenue. So there's a whole lot of sources of potential foreign exchange risk. Now, lenders usually avoid foreign exchange risk in project finance on the basis that they say, if you have a default in operations and it's because of a foreign currency loss and you haven't got enough funds because of foreign currency losses, then really that's your problem. You should have dealt with it better because, look, everyone knows how to deal with FX risk. So you guys are big companies and you're putting together an SPV, you should have put in enough expertise to manage foreign exchange risk. I mean, you should be able to have foreign exchange forward contracts and foreign exchange options and that sort of thing, and natural hedges and so on, whatever it is that you do. So the financier's expectation is that the SPV will have the policy that covers FX risk, and if it doesn't, they'll put it back onto the sponsors in some cases, which means it's not pure project finance. There's a bit of recourse in that specific instance. Now, as an aside, remember we talk about the parties to a project getting spin-off benefits. One of the big spin-off benefits is they say, all right, well, we expect you to manage your FX risk, and by the way, if you need options in operations, you've got to come to us first. As part of the conditions of us giving you this loan, you have to come to us for all of your hedging requirements. Okay, moving on. The next risk is environmental risk. And environmental risk, and people have already used it as an example tonight in the past couple of weeks of risks that we can perceive, because we're all very aware of the environment now. It's changed from when I was a kid, when most businesses didn't really care. But now, rightly so, I think we're all focused on the damage that's been done to the environment and trying to reduce and prevent that. So environmental risk, of course, pollution is an important and main one. And there's different types of pollution. There's air pollution, land pollution, and water pollution, and perhaps even noise pollution, although I suspect most people don't mitigate that. Although having said that, when those guys down there are jackhammering, they've all got the safety things on their ears, so they mitigate the noise pollution in that sense. Deforestation, land degradation, so again, not necessarily polluting it, but degrading the land. Wildlife habitat destruction is a big one, because there's, again, as you probably realise, we humans are killing off dozens of species of animals a year, and so we're trying to slow down that poor outcome. Heritage site damage. If you drill a hole and you drill into the lost city of Atlantis, you're probably not allowed to keep drilling. That's probably a better outcome than the project, of course. Greenhouse gas emissions, chemical hazards, radiation. If I've forgotten any, let me know. If you ever give me something that's really good, what I do is I just put it on the next semester and just claim it as my own, on the slides for next semester. So feel free to give me some good tips. Now, the thing about environmental risk is that Unlike the other risk where you sort of have to determine whether or not there's an exposure, the default position is that there's an exposure and you have to determine what it might be and what you're going to do about it. So environmental risks, as I said, unsurprisingly, of course, the nature of the project will determine what some of the risks are. If it's hydrocarbons or chemicals, then there's greater pollution possibility. Or the location. If you're near a town, there's bigger issues than you are right out in the middle of nowhere. Or if you're in a native reserve or in a heritage area, that sort of thing. So, as I said, the way that the world is these days, there is a very high focus on environmental issues, and what that means is any project finance transaction that is being proposed must pass a particular standard and get assurance of environmental compliance with the appropriate regulatory bodies. So we'll talk about that next week more when we talk about the mitigations. But what we see is that if you decide that when you're starting to look for sources of finance, you say, well, we're going to export equipment so we can go to the ECAs, and we're going into a developing nation so we can go to the multilateral agencies. One of the first things they'll look at before they even consider your project is, let us see your environmental plan. You say, oh, well, we haven't done that yet, we haven't done all our risk analysis. They'll say, don't come to us until you finish that bit. So it's a focus of those, because think of those bodies, they have slightly different mandates, in particular the MLAs. Okay, that's the example of the Chad Cameroon pipeline. What are the environmental risks that you perceive? Sorry? Deforestation, you're saying? Yep. Deforestation, absolutely. They've cut a dirty great trench down the middle of the treed area. Deforestation's a big one in this one. What else? It's quite a possibility, isn't it? It's quite a possibility. I mean, there's a lot of mist there, but no gorillas. Isn't it gorillas in the mist? Well, they seem to have all gone away. So, more broadly, there might be some specific species that are only native to a particular area. You can't bulldoze that area. What else? Noise pollution looks like noisy, but I mean, if a project makes a noise in the forest and there's no one around to hear it, is it really a noise? Is it really noise pollution? To paraphrase something a bit more famous. But you're right on pollution though, aren't you? I mean, this doesn't really look like mist, it looks like smoke. And these machines look like they chug a bit, so there's probably smoke being. So there's air pollution. Look, there's seepage down here. There's the potential for land pollution, and especially because it's a pipeline, whatever's going down the pipeline, if it leaks, that's pretty serious damage. So if it leaks here, it's polluting the land, but what if it leaks when it comes out to the ocean? Water pollution. And one thing you look for in any of these projects, if it's next to water, you can straight away say, well, there's a potential for water pollution because of leakage of whatever it is that you're doing, even if it's just waste products. So yeah, that's most of them, I'd say. So we've said air pollution, land pollution, water pollution, noise pollution, so we've covered the 4 pollutions. I don't think there's greenhouse gas emissions here or chemical. Yeah, but we've mainly covered it. Well done. All right, moving on to what Tinsley describes as country/political risk. Now, the broader category is sovereign risk, and it's the risk associated with going into another country and doing your operations into a country that is not your home country. It's a mix of categories, and in fact, I'm going to split it out to different risks. But expropriation is probably one you've heard of, and that is when you're operating in a country and they say, all right, that's our asset now, you leave. And we'll see an example of that in one of our case studies. It does happen, although it's not as common as you think. Currency and convertibility is one that is quite difficult, and that is you're generating a whole lot of your revenues in the local currency. In our case, it was Iranian rials. Now, no one wants Iranian rials. Not even Iranians want Iranian meals. And so we had an agreement whereby we could then send it to the government and they gave us US dollars. But there were a couple of times where they said, well, we haven't got enough US dollar reserves, so you have to wait. So you can't convert the currency. Regulatory changes, well, they can change tax laws, they can change environmental laws, they can change operational laws and regulations. Tax risks themselves, I suppose, a change of law, but not necessarily change of law. Interpretation. Bureaucracy. In some countries, the bureaucracy is greater than in others, and it stops things from getting done. Physical accessibility to sites. I think I mentioned before that when we were discussing in our project where to put some of the wells on the field, the seismic data usually indicates where's the best access to the reserve. And I showed that diagram earlier today, it was directly above. But then you go out and survey the area and it's really hostile and very hard to, you can't drive down there because of the way the rock formations are and so on. So you actually have to start thinking about alternatives, so not necessarily your preferred site. Non-government activism, strikes, that sort of thing. So Tinsley talks about these all in one group. Lots of others say there's three separate risks. There's country risk, political risk and social risk, and I'm going to follow that as well. And the reason is that I think they're sufficiently different from one another so that it's different sort of sources of the risk and can have different outcomes. So country risk is those risks associated with going into another country and just doing your day-to-day business, or even construction as well. So things like work stoppages, civil unrest, so you're in a country where there's a fair bit of tension, bureaucracy, process delays, inaccessible sites I spoke of, guerrilla sabotage, in some countries that happens. In fact, our seismic lines kept being cut. Every time we were laying seismic lines, some guys were jumping over the fence overnight and cutting them, just so that labourers had more work. Every time, so we just had to relay the same. Yeah. So sabotage, exchange controls, inflationary conditions, force majeure events. These all arise from being in the country. And so any of the factors have a negative impact on either construction or the operations, causing delays, causing extra costs. And a difficult aspect of the country risk assessment is that you don't know whether there's going to be activists against the project. And they might be activists because they don't want another mine in the country, or they don't want a mine here, or they don't care about a mine but they want to protest against the government and they perceive this to be a symbol of the government, this new project. So they band together the unions, the landowners, environmentalists, lawyers, and what is the political activism? It's things like strikes and even maybe as much as sabotage and that sort of thing. Now, political risk is a different aspect because it relates to the politics of dealing in that country. So, for example, a change of government. Now, that can be a serious one because sometimes governments, when they're going to election, the opposition will campaign on the basis that we're going to get rid of this project. In fact, it happened in Victoria about 5 years ago. We were going to get a road it was called the East-West Link, and it was going to basically bypass the city from the east, because if anyone drives on the Eastern Freeway and gets onto Hoddle Street, the bottlenecks are horrendous. And it required, they had to knock down a few homes in Collingwood, and there was lots and lots of political activism. And Daniel Andrews, who was opposition leader then, campaigned on the basis that if we're elected, we're going to tear up the contract. And they got elected and they tore up the contract. And it cost, the stupid thing is, instead of paying a couple of $1 billion to get a road that we need, we paid $1 billion in penalties for tearing up the contract. That came straight out of Victorian taxpayers' money. So this is a political risk, and it's not just confined to the developing world. It happens in the developed world as well. So that was associated with change of admin. That's always, you've got to be nervous because they might completely change how they do things. Or just the existing government changing laws, policies, regulations. Okay, we've got a new rule. No producing petrol anymore. You'd be in real trouble. I mean, that's a stupid one. That'd be one of the ones that, you know, doesn't have a good outcome for anyone. But it might be more that there's a new petrol tax. Or, you know, just changing regulations, you have to employ more local people and less foreigners, and that sort of thing. Environmental laws, if they change them, energy policies, tax. So if you go into other countries, you can face significant political risks. And it's usually in more subtle forms than straight out expropriation. They might just regulate prices. Okay, if you open a toll road here, there's an example I think on the next slide, you can't charge what you need to charge to make an appropriate return. We're going to put a cap on what you can charge. Restricting work permits for foreigners. The Iranians always played this game. Every time our expats went out, they took a long time to renew their visas. Renegotiation of contracts. If you've got a good contract, you don't want to renegotiate. If the government calls you and they want to renegotiate, it's only a bad thing. It's never a good outcome. Oh, great, they're going to give us a better deal. Of course they're not. Every time you get the call, oh, thanks. Even buyouts of equity, they say, look, sorry, you've got to give us 30% of the equity now. These things happen. So the serious one is expropriation, seizure of the project assets. We will see an example of it, as I said. Currency and convertibility, I've already described in the context of you generate a whole lot of your revenues in a non-convertible currency, and the government don't agree to convert it into hard currency like US dollars or euros or pounds. But really, it's different to foreign exchange risk because it's just the inability to actually do the exchange rather than the fluctuation in the exchange rate. Now, you shouldn't really get caught by this because you should be able to identify fairly readily where you're going to do a project, whether this could be an issue. Mitigating it's hard though. Other risk factors, tax and ownership changes, and I'll talk about that a bit later. Operating constraints, funding constraints. You might actually be told, well, if you're going to build this $100 million, let's say $100 million project, you actually have to put 20 million in the bank here until it's finished as a bond to make sure that you do everything right. So, you know, that's a bit of an impost, but you can usually deal with it. So a political risk example, Bangkok second stage expressway project, which sounds to me like a toll road. Indeed, it was a toll road. The government failed to abide by the agreement that they had with the sponsors, and when the toll road was finished and ready to go and had met completion, they said, open it, but you can't charge the tolls that you want to charge. And the sponsor said, hang on, up front we agreed with you guys that we should be able to charge 100 baht per car. And the government said, yeah, that's not popular, you can only charge 70. And the sponsor said, no, we're not going to open it. And the government said, yeah, you are. And in this case, and it's quite common in developing countries, and it's part of this creeping expropriation and equity requirements and that sort of thing, they had one of, it was a local body, which was the Thai Expressway RTA, as one of the sponsors. They said, look, you can do this in our country, but our constitution requires that these major projects have to be partially owned by local companies. So it's usually a great thing for the cronies of governments. In this case, it seemed pretty like they're the appropriate participant, but you know, we don't know whether or not they paid for their 30% or whatever it was. But then they went turncoat on their co-sponsors. They're the ones that actually, on behalf of the government, took the co-sponsors to court and got the court order to open the road at the lower cost. Now, you're never going to win as sponsors when a local company takes you to the court and you're trying to, in their own country, and you're trying to fight the government in their own country. It's just not going to happen. So, despite examples like this, it would be wrong to confine assessment of political risk to the developing world. In other words, it's not just emerging countries. I've just given an example of the emerging state of Victoria, where we had a political risk that was quite serious. Literally, it cost taxpayers in Victoria $1 billion to not build a road, rather than about $2.5 to build a good road. That's not a good return in my view. In the US as well, and remember I said in the first lecture, project finance started to emerge when in the US different states realised they needed to upgrade their power plants, their supply of power, so they encouraged all these private investors to come in and build power plants. And they said, yeah, come in and just work out what you have to charge to get the appropriate return on your equity investment. And then when it came out too high, they said, oh, you can't charge that much. That's sort of happening in Australia as well, because electricity has been going up and up and up. And so we've got politicians involved in saying to the producers, you can't charge that much. But economically, that's a bit of a problem if it costs that much to produce. So when we think about country risk or political risks, in fact, it's another motivation that I didn't mention. It's a more specific motivation for doing project finance. The reason is more subtle though. And the reason is that if you're concerned that a government might do the wrong thing, or the bureaucracy might be too much, what you do is you bring in a sort of a large and dispersed group of sponsors and banks, export credit agencies, and so large multinationals that are well known and have got a lot of clout on the world stage, and a syndicate of banks that comprises all the big banks in the world. If you go into a small country, the small country is probably not going to do the wrong thing because it doesn't really want to be seen as doing the wrong thing when all these big and important players on the world stage are involved. So that's the idea, that it really it's a subtle influence influencing the behaviour. What we find in terms of credit ratings, and again we'll see an example of it before we actually cover credit ratings, is that in the majority of cases, credit rating agencies assign ratings to countries as well as issuers. And so if you're going to issue bonds in a country, usually the maximum, the best credit rating you can get is the country credit rating. And there's probably pretty good arguments for that, even if the project is lower risk. Okay, the other element of this is what is known as social risk. Tinsley includes it in the country and the political risk, but essentially it is a separate risk because it's quite specific. And that is when there is either a real or a perceived adverse impact of a project on a local population or group of people. Now, a real adverse impact is something like having to bulldoze their homes, or operations that feed chemical waste into the river, that sort of thing. That's real. But there's also, and equally powerful, is a perceived impact. We don't want this project here because it's going to disrupt our lifestyle. And so the social risk is that there's a group of people and they start agitating more and more, this project's no good for us, and they start striking or sabotaging, that sort of thing. So the problem is, once the risk arrives, even as a perceived risk, protests and strikes and sabotage, all those things that we spoke about, then arise. So they're country risks, but they're country risks that are driven by the perceived adverse impact on local populations. So there will be cases where the SPV needs to evaluate the potential social impact, and in most cases now, but in lots of cases it's pretty much no, there's no impact, including gender and human rights impacts. I've always wondered about whether you can say there's a specific gender impact. I imagine you probably could in some cases. I used to say, well, look, if you're going into the Muslim world, there's clearly gender-specific issues, but that's part of their system, it's not part of your project. But then if your project somehow has an impact on the way that the gender politics run, then potentially that's a problem. So you have to evaluate that. The next risk, the next risk that is present in all, potentially present from the day you start the project to the day you finish it, is force majeure. As I said, the term force majeure means unstoppable force, and there's 4 types, but the one that we focus on are, well, there's the acts of man, but that really relates to social risk and maybe even political risk or country risk. So where there's strikes or sabotage, then that's a force majeure. Acts of nature, which used to be called acts of God, but God is different things to different people, so we're a bit more neutral in our terminology now. So acts of nature, so it's weather events, extreme weather events, and that sort of thing, floods and earthquakes and serious bushfires, serious lightning strikes, tsunamis, floods, I said floods, what else? Volcanic eruptions. Then there's acts of government, but they're really, you know, they are political force majeure, but they are a political risk really. And there's also the fourth element, which relates to serious market events. So, like the GFC, for example. So, some force majeure events coincide with other risks, and even you can find that technical risk, say water inflow from a flood, it's probably partly technical risk because you could set up your facility such that you wouldn't be devastated by a flood if you did it right. The last one that relates to all phases is legal risk, and legal risk relates to the documentation, generally the contracts. And remember, the contracts are the mechanism for apportioning risk between the SPV and the counterparties. So the starting point is the SPV's counterparty. I'll talk about that more. The contracts given by the counterparty, I'll talk about that more next week. But of course the way they work is that there's a very rigorous and sometimes very tense negotiating process. Sets of advisors. It's not just the lawyers are there for drafting, and they often will negotiate as well, but they're only part of the negotiations. So the SPV project management team will negotiate, and the contractors, the EPC contractor will have the the owner of the building company and all of his technical advisors and so on. So there's a big process of negotiation. But the risk is once you've gone through the negotiation, you've come to agree everything, because of the difficulties in specifying all potential outcomes, the advisors inadvertently create risks. And it's not just the lawyers. If the lawyers haven't been properly briefed, then there might be risks in the documentation, and it might create a tax risk. You might miscategorise an expense, and in the country you're in, it's no longer a tax deduction because you put it in the wrong category. For example, you might have something in there that defeats security, and so on. So we'll talk about this a little more. The problem is that most of the legal risks, most of the faulty contracts are where they haven't addressed a situation that no one expected to happen. And only when it happened, you look at the contract, and the contract is silent. Oh, we weren't expecting that. What happens then? And so that is difficult to mitigate. So in summary today, where I've finished is I haven't yet looked at the specific risk in operations. That's where I'm picking it up next week, and then we're talking about mitigation categories. The starting point is that risk analysis is important, but it's not a unique exercise to project finance. We just argue that it has special importance because of the nature of the project finance transaction being the risk allocation process, very formal. So it goes without saying the process of risk identification must be careful and thorough. You must up front be able to identify all of those events that could happen in the future and will have a negative impact on the project if they do happen. And once you've identified all of them, you have to do effective classification and quantification. So you have to be able to determine, and it's not easy in a lot of cases, the likelihood of an event happening. I picked an easy one because I said interest rate risk is easy to work out the likelihood of an adverse because it either goes up or goes down or stays the same. But in some cases, 1 minute before the lecture end, you're probably okay. That's probably something. He's probably told, ring me at 8:09 so we can get out of there, okay? So we're going to, the reason that we do all of this analysis is to ensure that we address and deal with, manage or mitigate the risk in the most appropriate manner. Now, identified risks will be project specific, but broadly speaking, what we find is the most important or the most serious of the risks are the completion or construction risk, which is really, and as I said, it generally arises as cost overruns. And then once you get into operations, the revenue and cost risks are very important, because that's what's driving the cash flows that are going to provide the return to stakeholders. But it's not, that's only a general and a broad statement. It's a good starting point. If you're thinking about what are the risks, think about construction risks, think about revenue and cost risks. But then you also need to say, in this particular case, political risk might be important, or foreign exchange risk might be important, or environmental risk is always going to be something you have to focus on, and so on. All right, so there's the questions for this week. Have a think about them, and we'll talk about them next week. Thanks again for your attention, and I'll see you in the week. Make sure you get your spreadsheets in for the assignments. Thanks to those who've already done it. If you can't find a group, let me know, and at least if I know that you're looking, I'll allocate you a group of other people who are looking rather than the randoms that are. In these circumstances, the compensation is usually only total. It's usually not the asset, the value of the asset. Because really what they're doing is they're just taking it, and they like the asset they want. It's illegal.
I think the oil project also has power plant. Maybe like burn the gas.
It's a good point, but maybe I'll have to reword it. This is a small.
Oh yeah, just a small part.
It's not the core of the project.
Maybe not necessary.
That might be, or it might have a different name. But remember I said there's core assets and infrastructure assets. That's an infrastructure asset. It's a good pickup. It's the first one I'm going to pick up.
I checked this picture.
Yeah, well done. In most cases, I'm never looking for that level of detail. I'm looking for the overall understanding of the power harnessing for electricity generation. Even just the high level stuff. Yeah, that's why we're going to talk about the resources. We talk about power plants, transport infrastructure, things like that. I don't think that's part of the possibilities.